Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar, which is organised by the Centre for Autism and Theology. My name is Harry Gibbons, and I'm one of the researchers working with the Centre. And I will introduce today's speaker in a moment, but I just have a few words by way of introduction to those who haven't joined us before. So the Centre for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 and is co-directed by Professor Grant McCaskill and Dr. Leon van Omen. We host interdisciplinary research into autism and other types of neurodivergence as they relate to theology, church, and faith. So the Centre acts as something as a hub that brings together all those interested in how neurodiversity and theology intersects. Their aim is to contribute to the academic discourse, but also to be of service to the church and other faith communities. If you want to find out more about the Centre, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can sign up for our mailing list and also find out more details about how to get involved with what the Centre is doing. You can follow us as well on social media. But today, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Elizabeth Agnew Cochran. Elizabeth is Professor of Catholic Studies and Theology at Duquesne University. She is the author of 2 books on virtue ethics and the historical Christian tradition. Her most recent scholarship brings her interests in virtue and moral character into conversation with considerations of neurodiversity. Our speaker will talk for about 40 minutes, and after that, we'll have a 5-minute break. During the break and after, you can type your questions in the chat box, and then we will have time for a Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to today's speaker, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. It's nice to meet you all today. And this is one of the first chances that I've had to present results from 2 research studies that I've conducted over the past few years. So I'm excited to do that as well. Both of these research studies are important to me because they've given me a chance to learn more about autism from autistic adults and teenagers. And they've also given me a chance to think more deeply about questions that I've cared about for a long time. My brother is on the autism spectrum and was diagnosed when he was 4 years old. Growing up as his sibling, I've thought for a long time about how his experience and my family's experience might inform my understanding of what it means to be human, and what kind of lives people are meant to live and what kinds of goals we are to have for ourselves. In thinking about my own life, I've always placed a disproportionate value on high academic achievement and on aspiring to a vision or an understanding of success that is attentive, maybe overly attentive to various social norms and expectations. And at the same time, I've also always maintained an uneasy recognition that my own sense of self and of what my life should look like was in some ways skewed. And that thinking about big questions about personhood in relation to my brother's life and my own together would help me understand these questions better. And then my son was diagnosed with autism 8 years ago, and his diagnosis and our experiences as a family made me reflect on some of these same questions from the perspective of an adult. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to take part in 2 research studies that, 2 research projects that encouraged me to bring questions about science and theology together. And I was excited for a chance to consider questions about autism and neurodiversity in more depth. But while I started to look at these questions from the perspective of the sciences and conversations with accounts of autism put forth in the sciences, I realized quickly how important it was to prioritize learning from autistic individuals and autistic perspectives and exploring these questions. So what I'm sharing today are some ideas that draw both on interdisciplinary research I've been doing and on qualitative and quantitative studies that I've conducted with autistic participants. And I'll explain in more detail about these a bit later. So I'm going to now begin to share my PowerPoint and move into the content of my presentation. The title of this is Autistic Ethics, Moral Community, Empathy, and Virtue. And I'll be working through this talk by looking at 4 different questions. And the first one is essentially the question of why autistic ethics has not been studied much, because it really hasn't been. It's an emerging area of focus, but there are some pretty precise reasons if you look at the history of scientific accounts of ethics of autism as it developed over the last 30 years or so. There are some pretty clear reasons why it hasn't been studied and is a relatively new field. So I am going to provide some historical context for this. And then I'll be turning to considering the sources that I'm using to better understand the moral experiences of autistic individuals, which are multifaceted and kind of emerging. But I'm at least exploring the idea that there may be some characteristically autistic moral experiences. Then I'll put forth my own some preliminary thoughts about my own ideas of autistic ethics in relation to the language of virtue ethics specifically, and I'll talk about my reasons for choosing this framework as we move forward. And then I'll conclude by briefly considering one example of implications this study may have for Christian ethics in particular. And we'll use this example as a starting point, I hope, for further conversation about the relevance this project might have to Christian theological accounts of the moral life. So first, we'll start with the question of why autistic ethics has not been studied much. And the short answer to this question informed the title of the presentation. Many presumptions about autism, especially those that were dominant in the 1980s and the 1990s, led to accounts of autism that essentially excluded autistic persons from the moral community. They called into question whether autistic individuals could exercise moral agency, be considered morally responsible for their own actions. And these presumptions have not completely gone away. They still have some influence in some conversations within the sciences. But then there's also been emerging accounts of autism that have offered a sort of counter narrative that has opened the avenue for recognizing that it can be meaningful and fruitful to allow for an account of autism that's more nuanced and complex and more able richly to participate in moral concerns. And as I said, be part of the moral community, the community of persons who deliberate together and who can potentially come to a shared vision of the good. So let me start with this trajectory of thought that I would argue is most responsible for the ways that research on autism and ethics has been overlooked, has been neglected. And this has to do with the account of autism that many of you may be familiar with, originally put forth by Baron Cohen, Leslie, and Frith in the 1980s, that associated autism with a diminished theory of mind. So the theory of mind was identified originally in the late 1970s as a capacity for understanding others' perspectives. And there's a lot of studies out there about theory of mind, when it begins to develop in human beings, whether certain species of animals have this capacity, in what ways it is or is not a distinctively human capacity. But this study by Baron Cohen, Leslie, and Frith determined that there's a diminished theory of mind, a diminished capacity for perspective taking, for understanding what others might be thinking in autistic children. And there have also been studies about this in autistic adults. And then this study was put forth in the mid-1980s. And then 2 authors of this study wrote books that were influential with clinicians and parents. in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So this idea that people with autism have a diminished theory of mind became somewhat popularized. It became familiar to the public so that many people, even outside of the academy, drew this conclusion that autism was aligned with a lack of theory of mind. And there are a couple of consequences of this that are important for understanding why there also became a widespread assumption that autistic people couldn't exercise ethics or could only exercise a very limited view of what ethics is. So the first we see in the sciences, but again, this is infiltrated to a public view. There's a widespread association of autism with a lack of empathy. One of the original authors of the theory of mind study, Simon Baron-Cohen, went on to develop research on what he called the empathy quotient, a measure, what he purported to be an objective measure of empathy, defined primarily in terms of perspective taking, and put forth a study that said that autistic adults had diminished capacities for perspective taking that he translated into a diminished capacity for empathy. So this presumption called into question whether autistic people could exercise empathy and therefore whether they could experience an important part of moral development, an important part of the measures the life experiences through which we come to acquire the virtues, come to practice love. This was called into question by theory of mind research and by its implications for conclusions related to empathy. And then the other important factor that affected people in relation to how they were viewed for ethics is the theory of mind research undermined the reliability of autistic self-narration. And the rhetoric scholar Melanie Yergo has an excellent article explaining more about this. But the idea is that, as Yergo puts it, if you lack a theory of mind, then this also leads people to question whether you can even talk about your own experiences in ways that are accurate, that are, appropriately defined in terms of perspectives. And so it accounts of, firsthand experiences, firsthand narratives that would seem to suggest moral feelings, moral sensibilities. These were viewed sometimes with suspicion partly because the notion that autistic people lack a theory of mind called their ability to describe their own experience into question, and again, functioned to exclude them from people's understanding of what could constitute the moral realm. And we know that at the same time, even again, as early in the 80s and 90s, there was an emerging trajectory of thought that I think opened the door toward being able to acknowledge the richness of the moral life of autistic persons. And I would say that this really goes back to the 1980s when the first autistic autobiographies were published and began to complicate the presumption that autistic authors are unreliable narrators, that they can't tell us about and interpret their own experience clearly. And then this was solidified even more in the neurodiversity movement. Just to sort of date it there, I noted Jim Sinclair's letter, Don't Mourn for Us, and its pivotal contributions to this movement was in 1993. This represented and furthered a cultural shift toward elevating the firsthand perspectives of autistic authors. And again, these narratives really are crucial for coming to recognize the complexity of the life experiences that autistic persons can attest to as being part of their own lives. And then finally, there's been much research in the last about 15 years that has really called into question the association between autism and a lack of empathy. And I would say that there's still a lot of work in psychology that takes for granted that autism is associated with a deficit in theory of mind. I mean, I've run across articles in the last 5 years that do just take this as a starting point. But I do think there's much more of a shift toward recognizing that whether you believe this or not, you can't equate theory of mind with empathy. So I think that there's an increasing consensus now that there are some flaws in the account of empathy and the lack of empathy and its relation to autism that was dominant for quite a while. And I will just identify a couple of important voices in this. I imagine many of you are familiar with the work of Damian Milton and his account of the double empathy problem, which essentially calls into question the ways in which debates about empathy framed the concern about empathy and autism in relation to searching for a deficit located within an autistic person. The presumption was if there were studies that seemed to point toward a lack of empathy, this meant that empathy is something characteristic of the neurotypical population, and autistic experience was reflecting a lack of something missing. And Milton points out that social interactions are a two-way street. They involve reciprocity, mutuality, two people coming to a shared meaning. And this is a problem that involves two people. So he calls it a double problem. It's not something that's located in one person and their failure to match up with another person. So he says that if there's a mismatch, if there's a miscommunication or a difficulty in understanding between a researcher and an autistic person whose empathy is being assessed by a researcher, then it's important to really look at that social interaction and not presume that one person is kind of missing a capacity for something when it's really a mismatch in culture. So essentially he argues that there's a double empathy problem at work. Autism is problematically pathologized. Autistic people are pathologized for failing to present empathy in a way that neurotypical people expect. But this doesn't mean that empathy is absent. And after Milton, several other studies came out that confirmed, or they would draw conclusions that fit with what Milton said. One of them, I'm actually going to not go linearly and point out the second one. The second one pretty much represents the position that had been previously used to justify the idea that autistic people lacked empathy. Autistic people have trouble understanding the emotions and expressions of neurotypical people. They can't necessarily contextualize them. But then the study by Shepard and Eddy, both of these studies argue that the reverse is also true. Neurotypical people have trouble understanding the emotions and expressions of autistic people. There's a cultural difference at work that means that emotions and ways of communicating occur in different ways that aren't necessarily making sense to each other. But it doesn't mean that empathy is missing. It doesn't mean that emotions or concern are not there. They're not being picked up on by neurotypical people in these studies. And Komita et al. Also puts forth a study saying that autistic people may more easily understand the emotions and expressions of other autistic people. So that reinforces the idea that this is really a cultural difference. Communication is perhaps culture specific, and that this has muddied the waters with regard to scientific accounts of autism, and really calls into question the idea that autism can be associated with a lack of empathy in any meaningful way. And a couple of additional studies further reinforce this. In 2020, Fletcher, Watcher, and Bird identify a number of reasons why the association of autism with a lack of empathy is flawed. And one of the things they highlight is that there's flawed terminology in a lot of these studies. So the concept of empathy is misunderstood, and also flawed ways of measuring empathy. And then they note some promising avenues of research to learn that can help us learn more about the connection between autism and empathy, many of which point toward the idea that there is actually empathy, especially in the form of emotional empathy or emotional concern that is experienced by autistic persons. And certainly, I think at minimum, there's a consensus that emotional empathy, a feeling of concern for others, a desire to care for others, is different from a capacity for perspective taking. So that's definitely where I would say people are right now. Finally, I'll just flag this other study that focuses on a lot of different articles about autism and empathy, and notes after reviewing 111 articles that in these articles, 31 unique definitions of empathy were used. So that's something else that really underscores how unreliable this presumption that autistic people lack empathy has been. Empathy is defined in really disparate and confusing ways, and it really isn't clear that there's anything to be said that supports the idea that autistic people lack empathy. But just to sort of sum up with the original question that I started with, I do think that this presumption about autistic people lacking empathy is a lot of what has led to neglecting autistic ethics. And at the same time, the time now is right for turning to and considering what autistic ethics looks like, because we're at a stage where there's a much broader consensus that this association of autism with a deficit in empathy is flawed. So this is the time to be thinking about autistic ethics, and we will now come to see this as we look at the sources that are out there for understanding autistic moral experience. So the first thing I'll just note is one article that is out there that was written 20 years ago, so much at the point in time when scientists and philosophers, this is written by a philosopher, were taking for granted the idea that autistic people were not capable of empathy. What's significant about this article is it kind of underscores, you'll see from what I put in the first bullet point here, it underscores that a lack of empathy, if that's really present, would be viewed as something that would get in the way of ethics and moral formation. But at the same time, the author of this article recognizes, even taking that for granted, which we don't really think anymore, I'm taking this lack of empathy for granted, this author still recognizes that autistic people are capable of moral concerns, moral feeling, a sense of duty and conscience. So she concludes that empathy is not essential to ethics. But she has a very limited account of what autistic ethics can look like without it. And the picture that I'm working to present with my own research is going to go well beyond what Kenna concludes. So she says, yes, autistic people can be ethical. It's not essential that you have ethical, but that you have empathy in order to do this. But she says, autistic people seem to be sometimes capable of compensating for their deficit in empathy and becoming, as she puts it, conscientious, though often clumsy, moral agents. So the picture that she presents of what autistic ethics looks like is still pretty inadequate. It definitely presents the autistic moral agent as well-meaning, but perhaps a little bit bumbling, a little bit clueless, but perhaps endearing. It's worth noting that this article is out there to show that it's possible to recognize that there's some kind of ethic that needs to be considered in our picture of ethics, even if when we presume the things that were presumed at one time about empathy. But this picture is going to be inadequate, and we're again in a better position now to come up with a more complete and rich and nuanced account of what the moral life looks like. Another study that I'll just point to is much more recent by Dempsey et al. And this is a qualitative study that explores how autistic adults look at Jonathan Haidt's 5 moral foundations, how they exercise moral reasoning. And in this study, the authors note that in particular, it seems that 2 of the foundations are dominant, and they most often arise in unprompted examples. The care-harm foundation, which essentially, I would argue, relates to virtues we might associate with love, with compassion, with altruism, and reciprocity, which relates to equality, to justice, to fairness. And so Dempsey et al. Suggests that these foundations may be especially important in autistic culture. And this was some of the background for the work that I did as well. Then what I'll be sharing in a few minutes is results from 2 different studies that I conducted at Duquesne. One of them is quantitative and one is qualitative. So the quantitative study is basically a study in which I asked autistic adults to complete a survey that was developed by the VIA Institute on Character to measure what are considered character strengths, a term that psychologist Martin Seligman, along with Christopher Peterson, they associate them with virtues, with strengths of character. And the study is normed insofar as it's been completed by people on numerous occasions who would be considered control groups. I haven't done a lot of comparative work yet. I've more focused on what tendencies, what trends seem to be emerging overall from the participants in the study that I did. And the questions central to the study are laid out here on the PowerPoint slide. And I'll focus on the first 2 in describing it. So one of them had to do with self-understanding, like what virtues do autistic adults prioritize? What do they see as important? What do they see as part of their own experience if they had to kind of identify character traits that are important to them? And then the second one draws on the VIA ISV6 survey to assess what virtues are especially evident in the moral experience of autistic people. And in the study, there were 119 completed surveys, and I'll share some results in a minute, as I said. The other study that was a source for this is a qualitative study in which I interviewed and talked with autistic teenagers and adults ages 10 and up and parents of autistic persons, and explored 4 questions related to happiness, virtue, friendship, and the role of religion and spirituality, and how this contributes to autistic well-being. All of these concepts theoretically fit together if you do work in virtue ethics. The idea is that, a happy and fulfilling life is necessarily going to be a life of virtue, a life connected to an effort to do good. And so it seemed appropriate to be asking these questions in these contexts. And I was really grateful for the chances to talk with 18 autistic participants and 12 parents of autistic persons. So I will now share just some very preliminary ideas from these studies and start with just a couple of slides that relate to background to explain why I said autistic ethics at the beginning of the presentation, and I'm now talking about autistic virtues. And I hope, one very theoretical slide. Virtue ethics is an approach to ethics that draws on ideas that originate in ancient traditions. So from philosophy, it's Aristotle and the Stoics. It's also often in Christian thought, thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas. Some later thinkers such as Jonathan Edwards also draw on ideas of virtue to talk about moral character, living in the manner that God calls us to live. And a virtue is, broadly speaking, a morally good character trait that is a necessary part of human flourishing. Another key point I will just state is that the exercise of virtue is a means through which human beings live as we were created to live. It's part of fulfilling our purpose, or our telos, the end for which we exist. And from the standpoint of this study, the reason it's helpful to understand ethics in terms of virtue is, first of all, that the focus on character that's characteristic of virtue ethics, a focus on character and who we are as people, gives a more complete picture of the moral life than some other approaches to ethics do. So for virtue theorists, ethics is not just about dilemmas or extreme moments, crises where you have to decide whether to let the bad person kill one person or put the lives of 5 people at risk. I mean, it's not these kind of crazy stories. It's everyday experiences. Ethics is about how we live, and it's something that we all do every day, just as we interact with other people. And virtue terms, traits like justice, courage, and truthfulness, are concrete enough to point toward a shared part of human experience, but also broad enough that they can allow for multiple ways of practicing them. So they provide some kind of framework for thinking about what the moral life looks like in terms that are fairly concrete and that can allow us to kind of make generalizations about shared experiences, but they're also broad enough that you can envision different people in different situations showing courage in different ways that would still be recognizable to others as courage. Courage might look different in one circumstance from another. One individual might show courage in a way that looks different from how someone else shows it. There's some potential for variation there, depending on who we are, variation that takes our context into account and our particular circumstances. And then a really important third reason is that thinking of ethics in terms of virtues helps us to avoid the stereotype of autism that suggests that ethics is simply about following rules, or that allows for the kind of minimalist account of the moral life that Kennett is willing to attribute to autistic individuals. When we talk about virtues, we can see that the moral life is rich and complex, and the studies that I have done suggest that autistic people are capable of living rich and complex moral lives, just as neurotypical people do. So let's move into looking at some preliminary conclusions that I think can be drawn from these actual studies. So in the quantitative study, respondents were asked to rank a list of 6 character traits from most to least admired. Analysis was done, conducted, focused on their rankings, and from this analysis, it was determined that the three traits that were most admired were kindness, honesty, and justice. And we see the numbers of participants who ranked them in first through third place. So kindness was the most admired trait, then honesty, then justice. And all of this was by more than a majority of participants. And all of these traits center on ways that people interact with other human beings in general, and particularly with strangers. And I would say this is important because that means that they align, broadly speaking, with virtues of compassion and of justice. In the same study, the three least admired character traits were courage, loyalty, and wisdom. And I will say, in comparison to the most admired qualities, all of these traits more directly involve skills related to, in some ways related to the self, to regulating or making use of our own internal capacities, and to a degree to relationships with people we know. So loyalty is different from compassion in general. It's tied to particular relationships. And it's interesting that as people were thinking about ethics and things that matter from the standpoint of ethics, they really elevated these other qualities that concerned love for human being in general, love for strangers, and concern for strangers. Then another observation from the quantitative study that's worth noting is that for most of the virtues, using the questions drawn from the BIA survey, trying to assess what virtues were present in the people who took the study, for most of the virtues, about 42 to 47% of respondents showed evidence of that virtue. But there was an exception, which was the virtue of what Peterson and Seligman describe as wisdom. And wisdom was noted in 72.36% of respondents, with a large percentage saying that statements characteristic of wisdom or associated with wisdom were either like them or very much like them. And these are examples of the statements that were ranked highest among this survey. So based on both parts of this study, I would suggest there's some conclusions about further work that could be done. The first is worth noting that virtues that are centered on love or concern for others, including strangers, may be particularly valued in autistic culture. This goes along with the study done by Dempsey et al. About the Care, Harm, and Reciprocity Foundations being elevated in their participants. Concern for others, love in general as defined in relation to looking at the world as a whole, are things that are particularly valued. And then the study also suggests the value of potentially doing further work on wisdom as a virtue characteristic of autistic culture. And I really haven't explored this myself, but I will just offer a little bit of context so that we have a sense of what this might look like. So wisdom as a core virtue, as Peterson and Seligman define it, is a kind of intelligence, but then as they put it, it's not simply about book learning or measured intelligence or IQ. It's knowledge, but there's a couple of quotations that clarify here what they're thinking. They suggest it could have something to do with learning through hardship, emerging a better person, able to share what has been learned with others. Later, they suggest that it's knowledge hard fought for and then used for good. So it isn't simply that you know things. It's that you are using knowledge that you have to try to make the world a better place, to move and support human affairs, use creativity and curiosity and judgment and perspective, these things that Peterson and Seligman highlight. I'm in this last quotation here, using these things to support others in the world. Okay, so I have this example from the qualitative study that I would suggest points to how attention to wisdom might work. And I would suggest it has to do with recognizing the value of what Joseph Strauss, talking about autistic culture, has described as, characteristically autistic ways of thinking. So this one autistic participant in her 40s, whose name I'm identifying here as Audrey, as an alternate name, from her actual name. All the participants in the study have been de-identified, is what I'm trying to say. But she suggests that as part of her neurodivergence, she sees perspectives in great complexity. She says her neurodivergence can sling out like an accordion, where you have dozens of perspectives spreading across time, across groups of people. I can see all those shades of gray. I can see all those differences and pull the complex threads through them in ways that maybe normal people, as she puts it, normal people, they go to the same church every week. They take things more on their face value. They may not see that long chain of complexity connecting all the ideas. And she's talking about the ways in which her neurodiversity affects her experience of church, of religious faith, of Christianity. And then the second quotation kind of highlights the moral implications of this. So she says, more and more, I can see how this common human striving for a greater belief has a lot of value. Being able to see all the shifting of that variation in a full kaleidoscope is probably something I'm well suited to as a neurodivergent self. And later in our conversation, Audrey goes on to talk about how this, her ways of thinking that she sees as gifts characteristic of her neurodivergence have equipped her to follow an account of altruism that's rich and complex, but also nuanced and a bit less extreme than she felt her experiences and expressions of it were when she was younger. This comes from applying wisdom to think about how she can process information and then use that as a starting point for doing good in the world. And then I will try to move us at least a little quickly here through some of this. But let me just say that one of the conclusions that I've drawn from looking at narratives and the qualitative study is that for a number of participants in my study, virtues seem to be grounded in an understanding of their self as fundamentally a self in relation. We exist in deep relation to the world around us, and our moral obligations, commitments, and virtues come from this sense of relationship. And I will tie this idea to psychologist Elizabeth Fine, who makes the argument that human cognition in general is inextricable from culture, and the kind of cognitive processes that get labeled autistic rather than being exceptions to this rule are exemplars of it. She argues that autistic individuals tend to have an experience of the lived self in the world that is more porous than is the norm for their late modern cultural milieu. She says that there's a deep existential vulnerability characteristic of how autistic people engage the world. And their experiences of self are so connected to their surrounding environments that for Fine, the category of autism should be expanded to include the cultural content with which autistic people interact. And then this is a narrative by autistic anthropologist Donna Prince Hughes. And I'll just highlight ways in which she talks about being deeply in relation to nature and animals. As a child, there was a time when her mother gave her a pebble as a gift on the first day of school. And she explains, talking about it as an adult, that she saw this pebble as a symbolic extension of herself. She also describes an attachment to particular objects and locations in the natural world that led her to identify deeply with them, a sense of, as she puts it, places as people. She felt that objects in the natural world had personalities, and she really wanted to follow prescribed routes when leaving her home because she felt such strong attachment to landmarks that she was concerned they might miss her. These natural objects were beings with their own personalities, their senses of agency. If they didn't see her, she was concerned that they would miss her and feel abandoned. And I have a participant from the study, Melissa, who also describes being in tune with nature and animals in childhood, and uses the term connection, talking about her strong connection to nature, her strong connection to the world as something that was deeply characteristic of her experience and formed her self-understanding. And at the same time, she associates it with characteristically autistic experiences of hyperfocus and a profound attention to detail. She describes, seeing the beauty in a weed and being very focused on weeds and specific trees and being able to notice these specifics. But this idea of the self in relation is not limited to the natural world. It does include other human beings. And Melissa talks about how she also feels an intuitive connection with other people. And her feelings are so profound that at times she has to numb them as a coping strategy so that people might not always watch her and be able to understand how intense and concerned her feelings are. She said when she was younger, she wasn't able as coherently to talk about and recognize her own sensitivity and her feelings of sympathy because they were so intense. She protected herself by kind of stepping back from them. But again, these deep feelings of sympathy, these deep feelings of connection really characterized her experience. I also share here a sense of deep connection to other human beings and a non-speaking research participant in his 20s. He described his sensitivity toward other persons in terms of a natural sympathy, saying, I'm sympathetic with lots of kinds of people. He says he's tuned in to others' experiences, and that at the same time he has an especially profound sense of connection to other autistic people based on shared experience, a sense that he feels, as he puts it, connected spiritually to them. And he recognizes, again, that his feelings of sympathy may be misunderstood by others, but stresses that they are really present, that they deeply inform his experience. And I would argue that this ends up being the foundation of virtues, a sense of drive to support others through altruism, through seeking out a concern for the other and trying to live out a concern for the other that is, deep and abiding and it touches the lives of people, broadly speaking. And 3 of the participants in my study independently use the moral imperative, the term moral imperative, to talk about moral commitments that are important to them. And for all of these participants, the term played out in slightly different ways, but their accounts of the moral imperative all involved a love and deep concern for humanity in general, which they partly exercised in practices of care toward people whom they perceived to be in particular need of care. And their use of the term demonstrated a commitment to the idea that human beings should love others because this is part of who we are supposed to be, how we exist in relation to the world around us. I think I'll just highlight the first example to illustrate this, and then maybe suggest that we could move toward the break that I know is common. And if people are interested in the final sort of what does this have to do with Christian ethics, I'd be glad to share that as part of the Q&A. But I want to be respectful of the structure of the webinar. So I'll just say one of the participants who used the term moral imperative talked about his intense desire, his striving striving to improve the world by helping others. As he puts it, I am driven to the point of compulsion about doing what's right. This moral imperative drives me. It wakes me up in the morning. And he explains the moral imperative, this internal sense that he needs to do good, to help others, has led him to spend over 20 years working in social services for the sake of helping others, working toward developing a plan for ending poverty in the United States. He says he feels a sense of urgency about this, the importance of helping others, an intense desire to do good in the world and help people. And when I asked him if he could define good, like how he actually thinks of the term, his answer focused on showing love and kindness to others. Good is doing the most loving and kind thing possible. I am very much driven by how do we make the world a place where everybody can be okay, where it can be inclusive and loving for everyone. So this is emphasized in Marcus's testimony and is a common feature in testimony of some other participants too, in ways that are surprising. So as I said, I will, the final big point that I wanted to make was basically suggesting that accounts of love that are explored in the participants in the study are nuanced and complex enough that they can actually enhance and effectively speak to the some of the debates that are characteristic of Christian ethics, conversations about love that are taking place within Christian ethics. And I have an example of this, which I'd be glad to talk about. But I do, as I said, think it might be good for us to pause and take a break. And I'm looking forward to having further conversation with you after that. So thank you so much for listening and for your time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a fantastic presentation. Lots to think about, lots to talk about. Yep, just to say again, we're going to take a break now. After the break, we're going to have a Q&A session. We'll come back at 5 o'clock for the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna move towards our Q&A now, still with Elizabeth here. So just to let everyone know, we'll probably go for about 25 minutes, just see how many questions we can get through in that time. And as I said before, if you do have a question, you can pop it into our Q&A tab. We've got people moderating them, so it might take a little while for them to come up. But if you have a question in response to something that Elizabeth's going to talk about now, by all means, you can ask that as well, and we'll try our best to get round to that. So first of all, we've got a question here. Sorry, hang on. So someone has said, you've talked about some autistic participants feeling that their autism gives them a unique capacity for understanding others. But what about autistics who feel they don't understand others?
Thank you so much for the question. I think that the sense of connection, well, I'm doing my best to make sure that I understand which participants in my studies feel like they understand others. I guess I should clarify that there's a couple of places where I sort of talk about that, and one is in this sense of connection. And it's complicated because in the qualitative study, there's definitely variation. So it isn't necessarily that uh, there's a natural sense of uh, being able to predict or anticipate like how the minds of other people work. I mean, I don't think that the scope of, I realize I talked a lot about empathy and about the theory of mind research here, but I don't feel like I have evidence from my study to really to speak to. Um, and I don't want to leave the impression that I'm trying to say that uh, virtue is rooted in a capacity to feel like you understand the um, experiences of others. I think I think there's a sense of connection that is not necessarily um, tied to understanding, but more tied to kind of an intellectual sense of the self as part of the broader world and part of uh, being able to kind of see the big picture of who you are within the in relation to the world around you. I apologize. I feel like I'm not answering this very well because I want to speak to I want to speak to what your question is really asking, and since it's being mediated, I'm not positive I'm actually addressing it. Um, I don't think that a lot of people I talk to felt challenged in some of their interpersonal relationships in different ways. I don't think that that has to get in the way of, in fact, I actually think that one thing looking at their experiences shows us is that that sense of challenge, that sense of not necessarily understanding what's going on with others, that doesn't have to get in the way of virtue. Because I think a lot of participants felt this sense of connection, but we're able to kind of use that as an intellectual starting point for living into a way of um, seeking out efforts to treat the world with love and justice that they found meaningful, that they found to be a source of joy, and I think that's I guess how I would answer. But if you want to follow up with me or send a message that clarifies more what you're asking, if I'm not answering it right, please feel free to. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I would remind people as well, if you're not comfortable sharing a question in this webinar, again, you can always email across. We'll send those questions to Elizabeth, and we'll try and get some responses back. Next one in from the chat here. So did moral injury or PTSD come up? For example, if an individual has been harmed, suffered injustices, not had the truth they've shared believed, and if so, any findings or helpful application?
That's a great question. I I'm ultimately in the process of writing a book about this, but I'm pretty early in it. So a lot of what I'm sharing are some of the preliminary ideas and conclusions, but there's a lot that I need to go back to and sort of sort through. I mean, the short answer is for the first part of what you shared, there a few participants did talk about trauma and its role in their own formation and their own development. And I think that they were in different stages of kind of working through the significance of that for their current self-understanding, and for their understanding of themselves as moral agents, and of the moral codes that they wish to live by. I I haven't fully drawn conclusions from that. I will say that I admire the ways that participants in the study were recognizing the impact that those experiences had on the impact that those experiences had on their own moral development, and had on who they are now. And I, appreciated the ways that they were sort of wrestling with these questions, because I think they're questions that touch a lot of people. Um, I I don't want several people articulated that earlier experiences of suffering taught them something. And I think it's helpful. It's one thing for someone looking at their own life and their own experiences of trauma and suffering. It's one thing for you to be able to say, yes, I've learned from that. I've benefited from that. Um, it's more complicated to talk about the role that someone else's, trauma or suffering may have played. I'm hesitant to draw casual conclusions about that, that kind of imply that I wouldn't want to imply anyway that, God does this for a reason, or that, some of these kinds of trite things that people say that I think can be harmful, and I don't want to imply that in any way. So that's why I think I haven't yet made sense of that in other people's experiences. Our experiences are so unique, and but I will say, just in terms of how people attended to and made sense of their own life experiences, I was impressed with the efforts I found of participants in the study to engage this thoughtfully, not to feel like those past experiences had to be limiting, and to sort of fold them into their senses of who they are and what their potentials are. I was really moved by some of the stories that people shared.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving on to our next question then. So you note that others-focused virtues rank most highly in your evaluations of autistic individuals, but is this realized or merely aspirational? And is this related to autism, or is it merely learnt from others-focused neurotypical norms?
Um, that's a really good question. I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part? I feel like I need to address these as two separate questions.
So I'll just read it out again. You note that others-focused virtues rank most highly in your evaluations of autistic individuals, but is this realized or merely aspirational? That's the first part of the question there.
Okay, so the first part was whether it's realized or aspirational, and the second part is whether it's characteristic of, like actually characteristic of autistic culture, or simply like learned from, or related to perceptions.
Yeah.
So you're pointing to ways in which any study of the virtues that relies on interview and self-report is really going to be a little bit messy, and this is where it's tricky, especially when we're in conversation with a tradition in which humility is perceived to be a virtue. I mean, one characteristic of Christianity is that humility is one of the characteristically Christian virtues. So I wouldn't expect to have an interview with someone where I said, so what are your virtues? And they would just, rattle off, oh, I'm very courageous. I'm very, it's complicated. So this question about, I mean, the realized or aspirational question, in the qualitative study, I talk about what people value, but their ways of describing the commitments that were important to them and the way they played out led me to feel comfortable attributing it's not my place. And no matter who I was talking to or working with in a qualitative study, I don't feel like I can go around being like, well, this person is clearly has this virtue. But the behaviors that were described, the attitudes and the intentions and the things that are being aspired to, I think that's I feel like that's all consistent with being able to say that virtue can be ascribed to someone. But also, I mean, this question of realized or aspirational, I mean, that's going to be a question that comes up anytime you talk about virtue ethics with anyone or using any sort of methodology too. It's uh, you're always kind of striving for something, but do you ever actually realize being a person who shows love for strangers completely? I mean, it's a very it's a it's aspirational, kind of no matter what. Uh, but that doesn't mean it's aspirational, but I don't think that's insignificant. I mean, I don't think that just because it isn't realized doesn't make it less real. I mean, but that's also kind of a worldview thing. I would make that argument to anybody. I don't think that um, I think that part of the human experience is that it's always just kind of aspirational and you do your best. Um, in terms of whether valuing these traits as characteristic of autistic culture or related to perceptions, that's really tricky. I did ask people their values, where the things that they care about or see as good come from. Um, Partly because I was curious about the degree to which Christianity, for those who were raised in the Christian church, whether the degree to which Christianity or other religious traditions informed their values. And answers were a bit all over the place, as would be expected, I think, with anyone. Again, I when you're doing interviews about people's understanding of themselves and their ethics, there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and people are different at different stages of life. The I would say that for some people, uh, the idea of other regarding virtues being like best or kind of the ultimate, that's consistent with a lot of positions that are out there in Christian ethics. I mean, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you know, anybody can love their friends, but I ask you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And I mean, the idea of love for enemies, or even love for strangers, kind of stepping back from actual enemies, just love for strangers is a Christian value. And participants in my study, even those that felt pretty complicated feelings, complicated and not entirely positive feelings about growing up in the Christian church, acknowledged that they were formed by some of that. Again, just like anybody is. So I don't think it has to be that there's like a coherent set of neurotypical virtues that autistic people are kind of unconsciously emulating when they think these virtues are good. I think for all people, virtues that are valued are messy. I mean, there's a range of reasons why you think particular traits are good. There's some consensus, enough consensus that I believe we can coherently talk about the good and about notions of a good life meaning something. But there's also a lot of variation, a lot of individual experiences. So I think, I think, again, that makes it complicated. But thank you for both of those questions.
Okay, thank you. Moving down my list here. So next question here. I'm interested in your thoughts on how expressions of autistic virtue, for example, moral drive for justice, truthfulness, stridency, can be received negatively or even received as vice by neuronormative systems, and how you would make sense of that within your framework.
That's a great question. I need to think further about the second part of it, how I would make sense of that within my framework. Uh, I do think that some of the participants in my study talked about the intensity of their uh, efforts to strive for virtue, um, along with the intensity of their emotions, which sometimes related to really strong senses of what the moral life should look like, about that sometimes being received negatively by people around them. Um, I had a participant who spoke about kind of a negative impact on her job or an incident at her employment that occurred that reflected people receiving her effort to what she believed was do the right thing in a way that was negative. I had other people talk about ways that family members or friends were at times put off by their efforts to be virtuous, to live as they believed were ethically called to live. Um, I think largely because of the intensity, at times because uh, a sense of extreme regard for for others can kind of appear to override or compete with concerns for family members. So if you're valuing compassion in general above loyalty, it's possible that people who feel like you should show loyalty to them might resent that it seems as if you're being more attentive to a fairness in general or a concern for the others. That definitely is something that happens. It probably is partly characteristic of human relations in general, but also some interesting kind of twist on the double empathy problem, or some sort of that's really, really interesting to think about. In terms of how it fits in my framework, as I said, I need to sort of process that more, but I think you're right that that's a good next step. It may have something to do with justice insofar as we think about how we live in a moral community together, going back to that phrase from the title of the presentation. How do we make sense then if people attempting to express virtuous emotions and to practice virtuously in different ways, and then how do we collaborate across these different lines? Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, thank you. The next question coming up is actually a question I wanted to ask as well, very conveniently. So can you explain more about your methodology, especially your choice to work with young people as well as adults in your qualitative study? In other words, what was the reason to take 12 years old as the cut-off age?
Well, I thought it would. I mean, I'll be honest and say I thought it would be. I think I said ages 10 and up. And my son would have been about 10 at that time. I thought going into it that I knew based on experiences with my son that this was kind of a time when a lot of these ideas about who you are and what matters to you, it really seems like these ideas are emerging. So it was kind of intuitive that I thought they'd be old enough to process and think through some of these questions and really be interested in engaging them. I did have some great conversations with teenagers about the things that matter to them and the things that are important to them. I did realize, though, in the course of this study that I had very different conversations with teenagers than with people in their 40s and 50s. So I and I didn't really take into account when I thought about this, the ways that our self-understanding does grow and change over time, and the ways that the things that we value as teenagers, and the ways we understand ourselves and what we care about, that's also going to shift over time. So there are just more people who are older have had more chances to think about that and be able to kind of go back over different decades and develop different perspectives. So over not completely, this wasn't completely the case, but I probably placed a little bit more priority in the last months of the study on talking to more adults. Not that the conversations with teenagers weren't helpful, but I recognize that when you're thinking about things like virtue and character, having more years of your life to kind of reflect on, it gives you more room to develop a more complex perspective. So I, in a sense, learned from that too. And I started the quantitative study with a survey a couple of years after starting the interviews. And for that one, I decided, partly for IRB related reasons, but partly because I honestly just thought it would be better. For that, I did exclusively work with adults. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This next question will probably be our last one. So apologies to everyone we haven't got round to. I know I've jumped over some of them. Like I said, you can always email in. We'll try and get those answered. Here we go. So you show autistic people do have rich moral lives, contrary to some earlier theories. Do you think that there is nevertheless something distinct about autistic moral lives?
So my instinct is that there is something distinct, but I don't think that it has to be the case that in order for it to be distinct, it must be something that like only autistic people do. I think that when you're talking, I don't know, I'm sort of inspired, and I kind of hate to go back to theory because I know the qualitative and quantitative study is more interesting to people probably, but the anthropologist Eleanor Oakes did a lot of studies on autistic sociality that she published in, I think, 2010 with a team of people. And I actually think that virtue might be something like the way she talks in these studies about sociality. It's not that talking about autistic sociality means that there's like only like a discrete way of being social, and being socially formed and developed that's characteristic of autistic persons that is completely different from all other human ways of interacting. There's going to be something that kind of allows for some sense that human sociality in general and autistic sociology intersect, even as there might be some things that are characteristically autistic. And I think I want to say something similar about virtue and how it works. There are ways of being virtuous humans that are, common to all humans. And there are simultaneously ways of, thinking about and expressing the virtues that I would say are distinctly autistic, but that doesn't mean that those are entirely at odds with how we think of human virtues in general. The idea that I was sharing right at the end about the self and relation, kind of that understanding of self is giving rise to this strong conviction, this strong effort to show compassion and justice. I think that is one of the things that I would say is a distinctive of the autistic moral life, but I don't think that that's something that only autistic people do. So it's complicated in that sense. But I would say that yes, there's something distinctive, but that doesn't mean that there's a completely different category of virtue. And I think it's important to say, I know someone said something about the meeting ending. I don't, I want to stress that while I think autistic people have rich moral lives, I also don't want to imply that they should be kind of objectified as like models of perfect virtue. Or, I mean, it would really be dehumanizing to imply that, um, or depict them as kind of unique sources of ethics because they're, sages or some kind of. I mean, they're human beings. I mean, we're looking at human ethics as applies to all of us and as it's lived out, and that's complex for both good and bad. So that doesn't mean saying that it's complex, saying that the lives are rich. That's really meant to convey that all of us have things that we kind of work on and struggle with, and it's good to expand our understanding of human ways of living that include all of this, and at the same time, uh, it's not. This expansion doesn't have to mean that it's it's distinct or unique in a way that's not seen elsewhere. But I still think that there's really value in expanding the ways that we think about what it means to live a good life. I think that our views have been narrow and have excluded a really extensive and potentially really fruitful part of human existence, because they've been based on norms that are defined by neurotypical cultures and neglectful of autistic experience. So,
Okay, thank you. Like I said, we're going to draw this to a close now. It just remains me to thank our speaker, Elizabeth, for such an interesting topic for discussion. Thank you, everyone who joined us live today, and to those of us watching back later on YouTube. If you enjoyed this webinar, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology's website to find out what is coming up in our programme of events. If you wish to join our mailing list, then you can drop us a line at cat at abdn.ac.uk. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.